In this video, you are going to learn everything you need to know regarding JavaScript functions. We are first going to talk about just a general definition of what functions are and kind of explain their purpose. Then we're going to talk about how you create functions within JavaScript. And then we're going to dive deeper into how functions actually work and then give you some examples of that. So first things first, what are functions? Well, a function allows you to write some code and then reuse that code throughout your program. And typically this code does a certain task. So for example, say you need to get a new user from your database. Well, you might write a function that completes that task. And instead of needing to rewrite that function every time you need to get a new user from your database within your program, or every time you need to get a different user, you can actually just do what's called call a function. When you use a function, you call it or you invoke it, which I will show you what that means here in a little bit. But a function is just some code in your program to complete some task. And then you can reuse that code over and over again, maybe using some different parameters for that code to allow it to be more dynamic as well. So you might pass a user ID to get a different user and so on, but I'll cover that in more detail here in just a second. So by using this pre-used code, it makes your code more maintainable, more readable. It keeps you from repeating yourself, because if you think about if you wrote separate functions every time you need to get a user, and then you realize that there is a flaw in your logic for those functions, then you would have to change that everywhere in your code in which you used that function or you completed that task. And it also allows your code to be dynamic. So for a function, it's going to create its own what is called an execution context, as well as its own scope. And if you haven't already, I would recommend watching my video on scope before this video. But for a function, it's almost you can think of it as it's its own mini program in which a specific function is going to be able to kind of store its own variables and allocate its own memory and so on and so forth. So a function allows you to write some code and then reuse that throughout your program. And this is going to be like a little mini program within your overall program. And it's going to make your programs more maintainable, readable, dry. So dry is do not repeat yourself, and functions allow you to achieve that. So let's talk about how to create functions in JavaScript. Well, there's a few different ways, but they're all fairly similar. So one way is called a function declaration here. And this is what this looks like. You use a function keyword, and then following this function keyword, you give your function a name. So I'm labeling this function. This is a function. That is my label for that function. And then following your label, you give it a pair of parentheses here, a left and a right parenthesis. And then following those parentheses, you add a pair of curly braces. So a left curly brace right here, and then a right curly brace right here. And within those curly braces, that is going to be the body of your function. This is like your little mini program within these curly braces. So anything I write within these curly braces here, that is the body of my function. And I can write some logic here. I can complete a task here. And then when I want to use this function, I can call it or invoke it, but I'll show that in a second. And then here in this declaration, we'll talk about return statements here in a second. But the first way to create a function in JavaScript is a function declaration. You use the function keyword, the label of the function, parentheses, and then you open a pair of curly braces here. And then anything within these curly braces is the body of your function, which allows you to write your little mini program to complete a certain task. And then the second way to create a function is called a function expression. And this is effectively where you assign a function to some variable in your program. And one thing to note here is that with a function declaration here, I can actually call this before I define it in my program. So I can actually use this function right here. So this is me calling this function, which I'll talk about calling a function here in just a second. But this is me using this function before I actually define it. And this is because JavaScript has a parse phase in which it goes through your code, and it will actually store this function to memory before it goes and executes your code. So JavaScript will actually store this function to memory in a kind of first parse phase, and then it will go through and execute your code line by line. And when it does that, it will have this function in memory right here, and it will be able to use that within your program. And this right here is typically called hoisting. It's thought of that this function declaration is hoisted to the top of your program. It's not technically doing that. It's more so just storing that function to memory in a parse phase before JavaScript goes and executes your program. But I explain this a little bit more in my scope video as well. So function declarations, they do have this hoisting behavior, whereas a function expression and any other functions within JavaScript here, they do not have that behavior. Okay. But right here, the second way to create a function is a function expression. It's basically me assigning a function to some variable in my program. So here I'm saying const, this is also a function, and I'm setting it equal to this function right here. So I'm using the function keyword, I'm putting parens on the end of the keyword, and then between the curly braces is the body of my function, just like in this example here. So I'm assigning this function to this constant, and then the way I would use this is I would use this label that I assign this function to, and then I can use it right there. But in this example, I would need to call this function, or I would need to use this function after I define my function here. So I couldn't, for example, use this function on line 22 and define it on line 26, because this expression is not going to effectively hoist, or it's not going to be stored to memory in a parse phase before JavaScript goes through and executes your code. So that is a function expression. And then you also have a named function expression, in which that's the very same thing as I created here, but instead of just using the function keyword, I also give it a name. So this is also valid to do. So I assign a function labeled my function to this constant, still a function, and it's just like up here, between these curly braces is going to be the body of my function or whatever task I want to complete. And then to use this function, I use the label still a function. I would not use the label my function. I would use the label still a function, which this is part of the reason in which I don't particularly like named function expressions, because I think that it can kind of be a little bit confusing if you were to name your function expression here different than what you name your label. However, if you did see this in your code, you'd usually see these be the same name here, and it might make more sense that way. But I tend to kind of default to creating functions in one of the other ways and tend to not use this way a whole lot. But that is another way of doing things that you might see within your program. It's a named function expression. And then we also have arrow functions. So arrow functions do have a little bit different behavior than just kind of regular functions within JavaScript. So I will cover arrow functions in a separate video. It's going to be the next video that I create on JavaScript. So by the time you're watching this, that might be out already. So feel free to move on to that after this. I would watch this video first though, but they do have a little bit different behavior, which I'll cover in future videos. But you can see it actually looks very similar to a function expression, in which we assign this label here, this constant, to just, I don't need to use a function keyword. I can just use an empty pair of parentheses, and then I use an equal sign and a right arrow, and then I open up a pair of curly braces, and then I have my body of my function here. So very similar to a regular function, but as you can see, I don't use the function keyword. I just use a set of parentheses, and then here, instead of just putting the curly braces after my parentheses here, I must use an equal sign and an arrow to illustrate that this is a function. So this is an arrow function, very similar to a function expression. There are some different nuances to arrow functions that I will cover in future videos, but it is another way and a very standard way to create functions. And I would say in most programs, this might be the most common that you're going to see nowadays. However, I still like to use function declarations, this right here, quite often, as I find this to be the most readable. You just use a function keyword and then you create your function. You're not assigning a function to any variable. Everything you need to know is right here, and it's very obvious that this is a function, and I find it to be a little bit more readable, especially when I'm teaching these concepts. I find function declarations tend to make a lot of sense. So throughout this function video, I'm going to be using function declarations a lot, and my default in my programs is to actually use function declarations, as I find those more readable. But I would say each team that you work on will have their own coding style and maybe a style guide and the best way that the team has decided to create functions, and they might, default to arrow functions. But I would say a couple of the most common ways that you'll see functions is these arrow functions or the function declarations. So those are a few different ways to create a function, but let's dive in further into how functions actually work. So for a function, you need to call that function. So to use a function, you have to call that function. This is kind of some terminology I've been using earlier. This is also called invoking a function. Either those can be used interchangeably. You'll hear both of those when you're kind of working in a professional code base. So what this looks like is that I have this function declaration here, and to call a function, you use the label of that function, and then you put parentheses behind the label. So here, in this example, I declare this function here, example function, and then within the body of my function, the only task that this function does is it console logs needs to be called. And then here on line 51, I use the label of my function declaration, example function, and then I put parentheses at the end of this label. And this is calling this function, or this is saying, hey, JavaScript, I want to run this function here. I want you to run this little mini program right here. So if I run my overall program, you see that it console logs needs to be called. But if I don't call this function, I comment this out and I don't use this label and put parentheses on the end of it, you can see that my program doesn't console log anything because I never called this function. When JavaScript goes through my code line by line here, it will just store this function to memory here. It will not go into the body of this function and run this function unless I call it using the label and putting the parentheses at the end of this label. That is just me telling JavaScript, hey, I want you to run the function labeled example function. And this would work whether it was an arrow function, a function expression, named function expression, whatever it might be. So that is how you call or you run a function within your programs. You use the label of the function and then you put the parentheses behind it. And as I kind of mentioned earlier with functions, you can reuse this anywhere within your program, however many times you want to. So I can call this function multiple times here, and each time I call this function, it is going to rerun this function. It's going to be like completely separate mini programs every time I call this function. So when I call this function on line 52, this call to this function has no idea that I called this function on line 51. Or my function itself has no idea that I called it on line 51. It just creates a whole new mini program on line 52. Now, there are some nuances there to where you can potentially remember calls to a function using closures and stuff like that, but that's a more advanced topic that I will cover in future videos. So here, if I run this, you can see that I console log needs to be called, this right here, 3 separate times because I call this function 3 separate times. So here you can see an example of how these functions allow your programs to be much more reusable. And you can repeat these tasks over and over, and you just have to write this function one time. It would be very tedious if I just had to write this console.log 3 separate times on all 3 of these lines, and then in different files in my program, if I wanted to console log this statement right here, it would be very tedious to keep writing that over and over again. So to use a function, you must call or invoke that function using the label of the function and the parentheses behind it. Now, normally you want to have your functions return some value. So for example, if you're getting data from your database, you're probably going to want that function to return some data. So how could you call a function and then return some data from that function? Well, that's where you can use a return statement. So a return statement is a keyword in JavaScript that you can use within functions that will return something out of that function. So that function body will run, and then whatever is after the return statement, it will come out of your function and that value will be returned to the calling of that function. I'll explain this a little bit more. Now, if you don't use a return keyword, your function will by default return undefined. So I have declared a function get undefined, and I don't do anything in this program. I have no return statement. It does nothing. So if I console log running this function, so I console log the return value of get undefined. So here, one kind of interesting note is that if you pass a function into another function, the function you pass in will complete its execution, and then that return value will be passed in to the outer function. So the way JavaScript does this, it goes inside out. So it's first going to run this inside function here, which is get undefined. And then the return value of get undefined is going to be passed into this console.log function. So in JavaScript, when you pass a function into another function, the function you pass in is going to run first. So this entire function is going to execute, and then whatever this function returns, or this is also called whatever this function evaluates to, is going to be passed into this outer function. So I'm effectively console logging the return value of calling get undefined. And when I do this here, you can see that I get undefined because this function has no return value. Now, here below, I have another function called get5. And when I console log the return value of get5, because it has a return statement and it returns the number 5. So what this return statement is saying is that the return statement is a keyword in JavaScript, and anything to the right of the return statement is going to be what your function evaluates to, or what it returns from the calling of that function. So I'm calling get5 here with the parentheses, and this function is going to return 5. So this call right here is going to basically turn into the value of 5. It's going to evaluate to the value of 5 because this is going to return the value of 5 wherever this function is called. And then I'm going to console log that number. So as you can see, when I run that function, I return 5. So it passes 5 in to my console log statement here, and that's what I get in my console output. So the return statement is a keyword that allows you to have a function evaluate to some value. Additionally, the return statement marks the end of a function, meaning once your function hits a return statement, that function is done. That mini program is no longer going to execute any other line of code. So here in this function declaration, I have a function declared return early, and then I have an if statement here on line 76, and I just say if true, then return this string value. And then here on line 79, I have return it was false. So if this condition is true, which right now it is because I just passed true to it, it's going to return right here, and it is never going to touch this line of code right here. But if this condition is false right here, it will never enter this if block right here, and it will return on line 79. So when I console log the running of return early, you're going to see that I get the output of it was true because I return it was true if this is true. Now, if I change this to false, you're going to see that I console log it was false because this condition isn't met. So I hit this return statement right here. So a very common thing that you'll see within functions is called an early return, in which if some condition is true, you're just going to return that value. And then you are not going to continue throughout your function. When you hit a return statement, that is the end of executing your function. Now, moving forward here, we need to talk about function parameters as well as arguments. So when you define a function, you can make them more dynamic by defining some parameters to that function. It's basically allowing you to pass certain values to a function in which it will change the return value of that function. And it helps make your functions much more dynamic. So in my example earlier, as you can see, like this is not a good function. It's called function get5. The only thing it can do is return the number 5. And as you can see, when I run this, I get the value of 5. Now, what if I wanted to get the value of 6? Well, I would literally just have to change this function. I would have to return 6, and then I would have to call it get 6, and then I would have to change how I call this function. I would have to use the get 6 label, and then, I could still get 6, but that seems very tedious to do. It does not seem very dynamic. So we can use parameters to make functions more dynamic. And here you can see that I have a function called add5. And here within my parentheses, following the label of my function, I can create some variable and then use that variable within my function. So here I create a parameter. When you declare a function and you put certain labels within the parentheses here so you can use them within your function, these are called parameters. And here I return number plus 5. So here, if I run this function calling add5, and then right here, now when I use the parentheses to call this function, I will pass in a value that will be assigned to this parameter here. And when you pass in a value to a function, that is called an argument. So here I pass an argument, and that is assigned to this parameter of this function. So when you define a function, you give it parameters here between the parentheses, and then when you use that function or you call that function, you pass in arguments that are assigned to this function. So here I am calling add5. I am passing in the argument of 10, which will be assigned to the parameter of number, of the label number. And then here I'm going to return number plus 5. And this will evaluate to 15, which you can see it does there. So when you define a function, you can give it parameters. And then when you call that function, you pass in arguments that are then assigned to those parameters. And functions can have multiple parameters. So here you can see this makes this function more dynamic, in which I take 2 parameters. And this function is now called add numbers. And I define one parameter called number 1, and then a second parameter called number 2. And then I return number 1 plus number 2. And there could definitely be more in this function. There could be an if statement here. So if number 1 is greater than number 2, then subtract the numbers or multiply them, else just add them together. You can definitely have much more logic than what I'm having here in these examples within these functions here. And generally, your overall kind of like global function or your global code here that isn't necessarily within one of your functions here, that can be thought of being within a function itself. So your entire program can be thought of as a function, and then you write just these mini functions within your overall kind of larger global function. But here, as you can see right here, I call add numbers, the label, and then here I pass it the arguments 2, 4. So that is going to assign 2 to the parameter of number 1 and 4 to the parameter of number 2. So whatever order you pass your arguments in, that is going to be the order in which they are assigned to your parameters here. So this assigns 2 to number 1 and 4 to number 2. And if I switch this, if I did 4, 2, that is going to assign 4 to parameter number 1 and 2 to parameter number 2. Okay, and then if I run this, you can see that I get the value of 6 because number 1 is going to evaluate to this first argument here, which is 4, and number 2 will evaluate to the value of 2, the second argument, and then it will return 4 plus 2. Now, what if you don't pass it a function arguments when it accepts them, when it has those parameters? Well, let's see what this does if I just call this function with one parameter. As you can see, I get nan, not a number. And the reason I do this is because I assign number 1 to the value of 4, but number 2, that's going to be given the value of undefined. So if I console log the type of number 2, and I see the type of number 2, you're going to see that I get the value of undefined. So here, I'm trying to add 4 plus undefined, which is an invalid thing to do and gives you not a number within JavaScript. So this is something to be kind of careful of within your programs, is you can get bugs like this if you try to use a function in a different way than the function expects. So this function expects me to pass 2 arguments here. And if I don't pass an argument, then I get an error. Now, what I could do here is something like I could use a check. If not number 2, then just return number 1. So I can do an early return here. And if I run this, you can see I get the value of 4 because I only pass it the value of 4. Number 2 is undefined. So this is going to evaluate to true. Number 2 is a falsy value, and then it just returns number 1. So you could do checks like that to make sure that someone is using your function correctly. You could also use something like TypeScript, which it wouldn't let me call this function without the correct arguments, which that is one reason I really like TypeScript. And I'm planning to create an entire TypeScript tutorial, much like I'm doing JavaScript here as well. But if you don't pass your arguments to a function that expects them, you're going to get undefined for these parameters, and that can cause errors within your program. So here, if I delete all this again and then I don't pass anything, I'm going to try to add undefined plus undefined, and I also get nan when I tried to do that. So that kind of gives you an example of making your functions much more dynamic using parameters and then passing arguments to be assigned to those parameters. But one last thing I want to touch on is passing functions into other functions. So I touched on this a little bit more, but in JavaScript, functions are called first-class citizens, in which you can pass functions the same way that you can pass variables around in your program. So just like you can pass a variable into a function, you can pass a function into a function. And I'll have future videos on higher order functions and functions being first-class citizens and some more complex topics. I just want to kind of give you an introduction here in this kind of more beginner tutorial on functions within JavaScript. So here in this example, I define a function called do something and return an array. So this is actually going to be very similar to just like recreating the map function within JavaScript, which I do have a video explaining how that works. And this function, it defines 2 parameters. The first parameter is labeled callback function, and the second parameter is called an array. So this function expects me to pass in a callback function and an array. And in the body of this function, I'm going to create just a new empty array here, and then I'm going to iterate over every value of this array that is passed into my function, and I am going to pass that value into my callback function right here. And then I'm going to assign that to my callback function return value. So I'm going to pass every value of this array into this callback function, and then I'm going to push that value, add that value to my new array, and then return this new array. And then here on line 123, I create an example array. On line 125, I create a function called multiply by 10. It takes a value and then it returns that value times 10. And then on line 129, what I do is I define a constant called nums multiplied by 10, and I call my overall function here, and I pass it in my multiply by 10 function as well as my nums array. So here I'm calling my function, and then as an argument to that function, I'm passing in another function as well as an array. And if I console log my return value here, I should see all of these numbers multiplied by 10. And you can see that's exactly what I see. So here in this example, you can see that you can add a lot of dynamic features to functions by passing in other functions. So here, I could very easily have a different function in which I manipulate these values in some other way, and I can multiply this by 100. And then as you can see here, all these values get multiplied by 100. And this is just a nice kind of general function in which I can pass some instructions to this overall function and manipulate this array in some way with the function that I pass in. So you can pass functions into other functions, but I'll create more videos kind of explaining that in a little bit more detail. But this just kind of goes to show you can make your functions very dynamic by passing other functions into them. So functions in JavaScript, they allow you to write some code to complete some task, and then you can use that code over and over and over again in your program. And these functions you create are kind of like little mini programs within your overall larger program that allow you to not repeat yourself in your code and write more maintainable code and make your code much more dynamic. And you can declare a function in several different ways within JavaScript. You can use a function declaration where you use the function keyword and then the label of that function. You can also assign functions to constants or to variables within your programs. So this is a function expression when you assign this function to a variable, and the same thing here, except I just name this function. And then you can also use arrow functions, which I will create a future video for. Now, for functions, you will not run a function or you will not use a function until you call that function by using the function label and then adding parentheses to that function. And within a function, if you don't return anything from a function, it's automatically going to return undefined. If you do want to return something within a function, you use the return keyword, and then you place whatever value you want to return following that keyword. And the return keyword marks the end of running that function. Once you hit a return statement, nothing else within that function is going to run. And to make your functions more dynamic, you can give your function parameters when you create your function. So you can use the label, and then between the parentheses, you can create additional labels separated by commas and as many of them as you want to then use those variables within the body of your function. But then if a function defines parameters, when you call that function, you should pass that function arguments or values that will be assigned to the parameters. And then with functions, you can also pass functions into other functions to make them much more dynamic. So I hope you learned something from this video. If my arrow function video is out, I recommend going to that next. Or if any of my other videos are out on higher order functions and stuff like that, that would be a good way to kind of continue your learning here. So thanks for checking this out, and I will see you in that next one.